Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Richard, for the intro, Nick and for Julie for making the invitation for me to be here, and I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagera people. What I'm talking about today is Making Things Right, which was a publication from the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation about agreement making, and follows the conference theme of leveraging critical impact through collaboration. So it's going to be a pretty informal presentation. The key issues I want to discuss with you this afternoon about some of the lessons in the history of agreement making, particularly focused in on those early years. Then to discuss, have native title agreements really enabled collaboration, and have they led to leverage of collective critical impact? And then a discussion on how to maybe improve some of the outcomes that we've come to accept in the outcomes of native title agreements. So the year I'm focusing in on is 1992 and 93. They are pretty busy years. And if there's some critical dates, just to cast people's mind back, and some people may not remember this period or not feel it as scarring as some of us. But Paul Keating only became Prime Minister in December of 1991. So Hawke resigned. His last act, Hawke, as Prime Minister, was standing under the Barunga painting in the mural hall of Parliament House, with some advisors hastily covering over the exit sign above it, as Hawke burst into tears over the failure to deliver the treaty that was promised at Barunga. Then Keating became Prime Minister. My colleague working with Robert Tickner and I, Murray Chapman, the late Murray Chapman, he, lovely man, we miss him every day, he did a search pre-Google on the number of times that Paul Keating had mentioned Aboriginal. And we found one every year in the Treasury statements saying the one line expenditure in the Aboriginal Affairs portfolio is. That was the only public statement that he made at the time. In February, the first meeting of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation with Patrick Dodson, the chair. Sitting beside him as his deputy was Sir Ronald Wilson, who was a High Court judge in Mabo No. 1, ruled against. In March came the government response to the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. There was a huge government response. Then in June, the Mabo decision. Neither the Prime Minister, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, nor the Minister or the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation were in any way ready for the Mabo decision. It was totally news. It was out of left field. It was very surprising. In December, Keating made the famous Redfern speech, declaring that 1993 would be the International Year for the World's Indigenous People. The document over to the right that you can see is one of the Cabinet and confidence documents at the time, now released by Archives, that says, if you can't read it, and I'm sure you can't, in the main Cabinet considerations, the bottom sentence where the arrow is, options for responding to the High Court decision, especially in respect to the best means of giving practical effect to native title, while creating greater certainty for various interests, such as the resources sector. So creating certainty for the resources sector was a major focus of this year of 1992 and 1993. In January of that year, the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, which was a bipartisan body, multi-party representatives, had the Liberal Party and the Democrats at the time. Some people might remember the Democrats. Cheryl Curnow. Members of the resource industry, members of the pastoral industry, members of the private sector business industry, and Aboriginal representation in the majority from all parts of Australia. This booklet that was created by the Council, Making Things Right, Reconciliation after the High Court's decision on native title, was produced in January 1993, 6 months after the Mabo decision, 12 months before the Native Title Act, more or less, and it was in the face of huge resource sector concern.
Attention, this is a test of the fire evacuation system. Please disregard all bells and tones, as this is a test and a test only. Thank you.
It's exactly the way the resource sector reacted. And just... the heart rate went up. There was fear and uncertainty was being promoted, being really cultivated by people with specific interests in predetermining the outcomes as much as possible. There was conflict, not collaboration, in terms of the themes of this workshop. Tim Fischer said, "I'm not going to apologise for the 200 years of white progress in this country. I will take on and fight the guilt industry all the way." This was after initial quietude, but the National Party burst out of the blocks with that statement. He argued that the ramifications of Mabo may place in jeopardy so many mining projects across the Northern Territory and Western Australia that the mining companies asserted that a flood, a deluge of land claims would inhibit mining in Australia, contrary to the national interest, putting a brake on the country and a brake on the economy and breaking Australia up, Tim Fischer said, words to that effect. The Australian Mining Industry Council, now known as the Minerals Council of Australia, took out full-page advertisements. So in the midst of all this, the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation opined that there were 3 major tracks to achieving certainty in the future. First, you could wait for further court decisions to clarify who has native title and its extent. This is a real option. Okay, government should sit back and just wait for the courts to rule where native title is and isn't. And to an extent, that has shaped a lot of the future of the Native Title Act. Second is government action. Government action would define the meaning and location of native title. Declare it, codify it, and leave it up to the states to manage in the land resource system. Or the third option was agreement making, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other parties could negotiate agreements. Well, what sort of agreements were we talking about? The resolution of land use and ownership would be through agreement after negotiation between informed and equal parties. Options for a formal agreement include local documents. The City Council could sign something. National laws or policies could be an option. Agreements between individuals or groups. Agreements enshrined in legislation. Or, this was the optimism of the era, agreements enshrined in the Constitution. What a good idea that was. Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation in 1993. But that issue was key to the negotiations around the response. There was a year of negotiations. There was conflict. There was consultation. There was negotiation. There was a slide. A year of conflict. The mining industry. We've mentioned before Australian Mining Industry Council, AMIC, but there was also the petroleum producers. They had their separate position. The gas companies had their separate ones. And the mining industry was positioning itself fairly carefully to avoid being the enemies of progress. But behind the scenes, in the early phases, they were lobbying hard. And we'll get to where they came to. Pastoralists. Pastoralists were represented by the NFF in particular, but also different state and territory bodies all had different views. And the farmers were paranoid, concerned about the fact that Aboriginal people might want access and entry onto their pastoral leases. I can remember Noel Pearson in a TV interview patiently explaining, with Kerry O'Brien hosting and some Farmers Federation guy, that no, you've already got access rights. They already exist in most states and territories. What if someone wants to come in and get a didgeridoo out of my place? Can I say no? Well, what's the existing law? What are the existing rights? What does it say? There are state and territory governments and a range of opinion and views in the state and territory government, with the particular problems coming from Victoria. Jeff Kennett said, every backyard is open to native title claim. Every backyard, you mark my words. He later apologised for that remark and said he didn't really mean every backyard. Western Australia was the most difficult. They had special circumstances. We've got the largest area of unalienated Crown land. We've got the largest area that would be subject to claim. We've got the largest mineral sector. And a national solution won't meet our interests. It's not an unusual position for Western Australia to take on any national policy reform issue, but it was strongly held at the time and right through to the bitter death, including a separate High Court challenge, if people don't recall that. The government departments, of course, there was a whole of government view. Not. There was trench warfare inside Canberra around the different portfolios and departments, with the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, the Department of Mining and Resources, Prime Minister and Cabinet, Treasury, Finance, all taking different views into the negotiation, different arguments. And there was ATSEC. ATSEC was a Department of State as well as an independent commission. So it was providing commentary wearing two hats. It was difficult for the people that were involved. Wearing the hat of advising the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs to take a particular view into Cabinet, and advising the Commissioners to take a particular view into negotiation. And the differences were quite remarkable. There was conflict within the Labor Party. We'll come to more of that later. Conflict with the Liberal Party, within the Liberal Party, conflict with the Nationals, conflict between the Nationals and the Liberal Party. See, that just doesn't happen anymore, does it? And the Democrats. Remember the Democrats? Who does remember the Democrats? Oh, okay, that's good. Okay, and then there were the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives. And they divided in the negotiations with the Prime Minister started to put together into the A team, the B team, and others. And the others are a critical group because they saw no representation in the negotiation. They saw themselves as unrepresented, no voice, no arguments. And some disinterested too, Aboriginal Provisional Government. I wanted to reflect a bit when I was preparing this. I was struck by the way in which the Prime Minister shifted his views. Remember, this is the Prime Minister that didn't know how to spell Aboriginal at the start of his Prime Ministership, and then comes in to a whole different view. Where in the Redfern Statement, December 1992, he said, "Mabo establishes a fundamental truth and lays the basis for justice. It will be much easier to work from that basis than has ever been the case in the past." And he kept coming back to that as truth as the basis of claim, truth as the basis for recognition and rights, rather than largesse of government. And this is something, when we look at agreement making around Australia today, that truth of ownership that is critically important. Then when the negotiations with the A-team, most of whom are pictured there, started to break down in early 1993, he said, "I doubt whether Indigenous leaders would ever psychologically make the change to come into a process, to be part of it, and to take the burden of responsibility which went with it, whether they could ever summon the authority of their own community to negotiate for and on their behalf." That was the low point of negotiations. It was known as Black Friday. And then in the second reading speech introducing the legislation in November, December, he says, "Mr. Speaker, some seem to see the High Court as having just handed Australia a problem. The fact is that the High Court has handed this nation an opportunity." And then in 2011, he accepted an invitation to speak to the Lowitja O'Donoghue oration. And she pointed out that Lowitja decided that after this breakup here, that for the first time in the 204-year history of the settled country, its Indigenous people sat in full concert with the government of it all. That's why I'm here tonight, to acknowledge that moment of leadership and to celebrate it. So the transition of leadership in the mind of Paul Keating is quite remarkable and shows a great sense of possibility. I mean, I look forward to another Prime Minister later having a similar transition, but now I'll leave that to it. It's clear that he started off from no knowledge, no empathy, no decision, but he took an intellectual interest in it. And he paid a huge political price in getting to an agreement with the Aboriginal negotiators, led by Lowitja O'Donoghue. He came to a position where he owned the outcome. It was the Prime Minister's outcome. It wasn't the Cabinet. His Cabinet, right up until the introduction of the legislation, or just before the introduction of the legislation, said, "Mate, don't go for it. Just drop it. We can't get this through. Just leave it." And he said, "You've got to be joking. Not going to let it go." This is the Prime Minister that when the native title decision came down from the High Court, that he was being briefed on the outcomes of it for the first time. And Sandy Holway, the Deputy Secretary of the Department, was going up to brief him and said, "This is what it looks like, this is what it means." And Sandy had laryngitis, so he couldn't really brief him. So he brought along me to say, this is what we're going to, and Kevin will talk. And I gave him the summary outcomes that he could have read in the Australian or the Fin Review. And he says, "Geez, it's a fucking can of worms." That's where he started from. And he thought about it some more and says, "You know what? I really want to do something in this space." I mean, always had that feeling that when you're a kid and you're in someone else's backyard, you know, that strange sort of feeling. It's like that. We don't really belong here unless we do something properly about this. And he lived up to that. And the third thing I remember him saying was, "Anyway, if it doesn't work, we can wire the place on our way out." So personal leadership is essential to conflict resolution, consultation and negotiation. The Council also tried to do that, the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, with the mining sector, led by Robert Champion de Crepney from Poseidon Gold, and Galarrwuy Yunupingu, Archie Barton, Wenton Rabunja and Jenny George, head of the ACTU. They set up a process of negotiation with mining industries to establish ways of getting dialogue and communication and codes of conduct for agreement making with Aboriginal interests, spearheaded by the land councils, and with mining interests spearheaded by the AMIC. So they wanted to establish a joint council on Aboriginal land and mining. I'm good at acronyms, okay? I came up with JCALM. Quite proud of that. JCALM never happened though. And it's interesting to think of why. A couple of reasons that came to mind after a while was one of the things that Robert Champion de Crepney was used to doing in mining business was being able to pick and choose who he was going to negotiate with from another side. So he was dealing with the nominee of the land councils, Tracker Tillmouth. And he found Tracker a bit difficult. Unusual, I don't know why. But, sorry? Okay, so he said, no, Land Council have to get another nominee. So the JCAM never met. And no one, well, they did meet, but it was perfunctory. There are a few lessons that I learned, personal lessons, I think, that from that period. The only deal that sticks is when there's something in it for everyone. That was the late Rick Farley was saying that. And it's one of the reasons the pastoralists got a better passage of legislation than the miners, because he was interested in making deals that stick. And the other line he used was, dealing with the Aboriginal population, they're not going to go away. We are. So you've got to make deals that stick. You can't choose who you're negotiating with. Negotiating from a position of rights is always more powerful and strong than negotiating from a position of relying on the generosity of who you're negotiating with. That governments can change the outcomes of any negotiation process at its pleasure and in its own time. And that's a reality that people have to bear in mind in negotiating agreements that have got government as a party. It's always just a fact of sovereignty. And the final thing is never underestimate the internal conflict and the passion and aggression that is played out internally, even with everyone on the same side. We slip through to native title agreements now, post the Native Title Act, and post the passage of the bucket loads of extinguishment legislation that led to the Indigenous Land Use Agreement. And I'm here looking through the work that the University of Melbourne, under the leadership of Marcia Langton, have done on agreements, treaties and negotiated settlements, their database and website project, which I recommend to people. They've counted some 4,000 agreements that have been signed since 1993, with substantial Indigenous employment and enterprise outcome. That there's been a transformation from the acrimonious conflict that was of the time I described to mutually beneficial agreement making. Now, they argue that there's a positive approach by minerals companies fostering respect for Aboriginal culture and history and delivering tangible socio-economic benefits. There are thousands of agreements collectively amounting to a bargain with Indigenous people over the use and access to land. Now, this is a very positive portrayal, in summary, of some 4,000 agreements, and there are some who may beg to differ in the quality of those agreements and the quality of the outcomes, in the quality of the employment benefits, in the quality of the financial benefits. And maybe there's some truth in the view that some would hold that really the agreements have got most native title agreements have got such problems that they are not sustainable in the long term, that they're not transformative, that they're more about netball bibs than about access to country, and that they become the sites of internal conflict with Indigenous landholders. And I would tend towards agreeing with a lot of that. But the University of Melbourne is arguing that these agreements are the social licence for the minerals industry to operate in or near Aboriginal communities, and the social licence is achievable. I'd recommend also looking, but time doesn't give it to me, to Kieran Afakale's work showing weaknesses in the statutory system of agreement making that requires reform. Some of the issues that require reform that have been outlined by Professor Langton at a Minerals Council presentation in 2016, from conflict to cooperation. Power imbalances. Yep, weaker party, lesser party, who gets a good deal? The resources and capacity of native title corporation and prescribed bodies corporate. It's a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed. Monitoring compliance with agreement, that these are concerns that they have. There's a lack of implementation plans. You don't see what's going to be delivered when. That the agreements aren't transparent. So there's only some 40 of those 4,000 that you can actually get copies to publicly, as I understand it. The short-term agreement horizons. The negotiations that were being carried out in 92, 93 were long-term agreement horizons about shaping the country into the future. And the important one, that the agreements where policy reform is needed, is managing internal conflicts and interests. That's not just Indigenous conflict and interest, by the way. So they had an agreement in Duke and George. They had an agreement between PKKP that was long-standing, that had been approved, had been endorsed. But the take it or leave it basis of that agreement is characteristic of a lot of, or many of the agreements that are there. The PKKP, now I'm quoting from this good-looking dude here, Warren Inch, who's a member for Kennedy. No, that's Katter. So, Leichhardt, thank you very much. It's all slipping away from me. Who chaired the Joint Standing Committee on Northern Australia. The title of their report, the Joint Standing Committee, that was released in November, was Never Again. Well, I don't know. I hope that's true. But in the agreements, I'm only focusing in on the aspects of agreement making that led in part to the destruction of 40,000 years of heritage. They were required, the Indigenous organisation, to give up their rights to contest company decisions. They were required to give up their right to raise concerns. They were required to give up their right to use Commonwealth or state legislation to protect heritage sites. Now, there are other problems, West Australian government problems, Aboriginal organisation problems, Commonwealth government problems, Commonwealth Minister for the Environment, Commonwealth Minister for Aboriginal Affairs that led to it. But I'm focused in on the agreement making. They signed an early fixed agreement with the traditional owners that advantaged the mining companies and locked it into place before heritage surveys had been carried out. Free, prior and informed consent was not applied. That consent requires an ongoing process of review and engagement with traditional owners. And the role of the National Native Title Tribunal as umpire was reported in by Warren Inch's committee. The playing field for agreement making is never level. That's a quote from not a party political report, Joint Standing Committee on Northern Australia. Playing field for agreement making is never level. So how can we move as working particularly with rep bodies and prescribed bodies corporate to ensure that we can look ahead to better agreement making? For a start, I think the native title rep bodies need to be resourced and need to be empowered. There was a discussion at our earlier table about land management and the fact that people are under-resourced to be able to do basic land management or to include basic land management options for future use in agreements. Negotiations need to be facilitated. This is something that it's a bugbear of mine because it's not supported centrally. There was arguments at the Native Title Implementation Task Force to say, yes, it could have a federal court that decides on native title claims, but couldn't we also have a mediation capacity that's empowered to get through sticking points, to assist traditional owners in all the disparity of their conditions, to get through, to be not a last resort decision-making body, but to be a facilitating body that reached better outcomes. PBCs need support for their negotiating. That's part of the resources. Outcomes for these agreements need to be monitored and publicly reported. They then could start to be driving parts of regional agreements, and then perhaps native title rep bodies could be part of the building blocks of the architecture of the regional elements of a national voice to the Parliament, not necessarily and only to the government. To get that, you need really cultural changes. You need cultural changes that are the sort of saying that we actually wish to empower Indigenous groups and native title bodies to be able to be full, equal partners at the table. You need policy changes in a range of portfolios and particularly the Prime Minister and Cabinet Department that are engaged in developing these resources. We need legislative change, I think, to the Native Title Act, to the EPBC, the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is singularly badly placed to deal with issues of complexity like the heritage of Duke and George, and to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act as being more than an act of last resort, but a commitment by a nation to say Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage, we think it's worth protecting. In looking for a summary point where it could all go, these changes, is in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's all there. We agreed it in 2009, we just haven't implemented it in legislation in Australia. So I hope I haven't been too discursive, but I want to finish with some points that I bear in mind in relation to agreements. A, authority. Authority to deliver results, authority to negotiate. A, G, governance to support outcomes and deliver. R, resources to build a position to facilitate the results. AGRE, engagement, the community engagement of all stakeholders, and AGREE, see what I did there? Agree? Equality of negotiation, stakeholders, and sharing of power. Thank you very much.